My own father threw a 200-page blueprints folder straight at my face in front of 24 international steel investors, called me a non-certified grease monkey, and stripped my name from the $45 million Family Industrial Trust. The heavy brass binder caught my cheek, drawing a thin line of blood that dripped onto the pristine marble floor of the Chicago executive boardroom. He didn't look at the blood. He didn't look at the scar on my left arm from when I pulled his burning machinery out of a collapsed furnace at 21. He just pointed a trembling, spotted finger toward the glass doors and screamed, "Get out of my tower, you uneducated zero! Your hustle belongs to the dirt. This firm runs on credentials, and your dirty hands are an embarrassment to the Vance name." Beside him, my older brother Gavin adjusted his custom platinum gear ring, a smug, venomous smirk carved into his soft, Harvard-molded face. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. "You built this empire, little brother. But we own the keys." The elite investors from New York and Tokyo sat in deafening silence, watching the patriarch of Vance Heavy Industries publicly execute his youngest son's dignity. They thought I would beg. They thought I would shout, wave my 10 years of undocumented mechanical innovations, or point out that the automated foundry line behind them was running entirely on code I wrote while bleeding in the grease pits at 3:00 a.m. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wipe the blood from my jaw. I reached down, picked up my grandfather's Hongi steel caliper from the mahogany table, slid it into my pocket, looked my father straight in his cold, arrogant eyes, and said, "Okay, fine." I walked out of that skyscraper with my spine locked straight and my hands perfectly steady. By sunrise, I had cleared my personal lockers, deleted my private encryption keys from their secondary servers, and left Chicago behind in a cloud of exhaust. Exactly 21 days later, the same family that called me trash would be choking on a $14 million forensic trap they never saw coming. Before I reveal the precise mathematical mechanics of how I broke their entire industrial dynasty without breaking a single law, do me a favor. Tell me what time it is, what city you are watching from, and what the weather feels like outside your window right now. Let's see how far the cold truth travels when the real engine stops working. I grew up in the industrial shadow of the south side of Chicago, where the only thing thicker than the smog was the family obsession with institutional status. My father, Arthur Vance, was a man who worshipped paper. To him, a man's worth wasn't measured by the structural integrity of his welds or the efficiency of his hydraulic lines. It was measured by the gold-embossed seal on his Ivy League degree. He was an engineer who hadn't touched an actual wrench in 30 years, treating his boardroom desk like a throne of moral and intellectual superiority. My older brother Gavin followed that corporate religion like a cult disciple. He went to private prep schools, wore tailored suits to breakfast, and learned how to use expensive financial jargon to mask his complete lack of practical capability. My sister Chloe learned early how to navigate high society charity galas, turning her life into a curated performance of upper-class maturity. And then there was me. I was the anomaly in the Vance blueprint. When I was 12, I wasn't playing golf with my father's clients. I was in the back alley of our manufacturing plant, collecting discarded hydraulic pumps and burnt-out microcontrollers. I turned our residential garage into an unauthorized automation workshop. By 14, I was rebuilding automated pneumatic drills for local independent auto shops, writing custom firmware on a cracked laptop I bought with cash from scrap metal sales. I didn't care about the theories in textbook glossaries. I cared about why a specific pressure valve blew at 4,000 pounds per square inches and how a 3-line patch of logic code could prevent a multi-ton press from crushing a worker's hand. My father called it cute grease monkey garage work. He would stand at the kitchen island, swirling his scotch, and tell me that a man without a formal engineering credential was nothing but a glorified janitor with a tool belt. When Gavin secured an executive internship through our father's connections, the family celebrated with a private dinner at the exclusive Union League Club. When Chloe got her name printed in the social registries, my parents called our relatives across the coast. But when I was 19 and spent 48 straight hours inside our primary blast furnace room, manually recalibrating a failing automated cooling line that saved the company from a $3.2 million production halt, my father didn't even look up from his financial printouts. He just checked his watch and said, "That energy would be more impressive if you spent it inside an actual university classroom instead of playing hero in the dirt." To appease them, I enrolled in a prestigious mechanical engineering program in Michigan. I lasted exactly 2 semesters. Every lecture felt like a prison sentence, listening to tenured professors describe hydraulic dynamics through PowerPoint slides while I had already lived through the visceral, high-stakes reality of industrial failures. They talked about safety tolerances in theory. I had the heavy burn scar on my left arm to prove I knew what molten steel felt like when a pipe ruptured. I wasn't lazy. I was misaligned with their corporate theater. The day I told my father I was leaving the university to work directly in the independent automation sector, his face turned into a mask of pure disgust. He didn't ask about the proprietary code I was developing. He asked how he was supposed to explain to his country club associates that his youngest son was a college dropout who wore steel-toed boots to work. He told me that without a degree, no serious defense contractor or global logistics firm would ever trust me with $1 of capital or a shred of executive authority. Gavin laughed in my face, calling me a blue-collar romantic who wanted special treatment for being too stupid to pass exams. I left their mansion that night. I rented a tiny, freezing loft above a metal stamping shop in Cicero, Illinois. I worked until my wrists throbbed and my eyes burned from welding arcs. I learned international maritime shipping laws, automated PLC programming, component logistics, and contract structures at 2 a.m., while the floor below me shook from the heavy machinery. And do you know what cut the deepest during those brutal years? It wasn't being broke or eating cold food out of tin cans. It was realizing that my own blood would have preferred to see me fail in a respectable, predictable way rather than see me conquer an industry in a way they couldn't claim credit for. Have you ever felt like the people who claimed they were guiding you were actually terrified of the version of you they couldn't put a collar on? The business I built over the next decade, Vance Industrial Automation, wasn't born from a venture capital check. It was built on pure forensic data and absolute mechanical reality. I saw that hundreds of independent manufacturing plants, specialized defense suppliers, and private maritime shipping docks across the Great Lakes were failing. Not because they couldn't build great things, but because they had zero automated infrastructure, zero logistics efficiency, and no one teaching them how to transition into the digital age without getting swallowed by multi-billion-dollar conglomerates. I spent my entire 20s inside those mid-sized factories, writing custom automation scripts, negotiating bulk component discounts, and sleeping on grease-stained cot beds next to control panels because I couldn't afford a real office. When I turned 26, I met my operational anchor, an iron-willed logistics expert named Marcus Stone, who spent 20 years as a procurement head for the naval yards. Marcus saw what my family had spent my entire life denying. I wasn't a reckless hustler. I was a clinical, hyper-efficient operator. Together, we turned my automation code into an unyielding ecosystem. We built automated manufacturing frameworks, heavy-duty robotic control tools, and custom supply chain software designed exclusively for independent, heavy industrial firms. I wasn't fixing machines. I was rebuilding the foundational spine of American mid-tier manufacturing. The journey almost broke me twice. 3 years ago, a massive semiconductor supply chain freeze threatened to wipe out my entire engineering pipeline. I maxed out every personal credit line, risked my entire engineering facility, and paid off the entire structural deficit in 6 months of brutal, sleepless execution. I spent one entire winter in our first real machine shop, wearing 3 layers of thermal gear indoors because I chose to fund my employees' healthcare over building heating. Every single scar, every invoice, and every sleepless night came with a heavy cost, and none of it came with a university syllabus. By 30, my firm had 45 elite automation engineers, 3 separate manufacturing facilities, and a proprietary logistics engine that major Wall Street analysts were trying to dissect. By 32, my personal stake in the company had given me a liquid net worth of $45 million, but I still didn't tell my family the actual data. I lied to myself, thinking I was protecting the fragile piece of our family dynamic. The truth was uglier. An ancient, unhealed part of me still wanted them to acknowledge my worth before the numbers made my success undeniable. So, I kept showing up small in rooms where I was carrying the heaviest burdens. When my father's primary foundry faced a critical $1.8 million environmental compliance penalty that would have destroyed their stock value, a private, anonymous corporate trust suddenly purchased their non-performing debt and wiped the slate clean. When Gavin came up short on a massive multi-million-dollar industrial land acquisition in Indiana, mysterious liquidity appeared through an offshore family friend of a friend. When my sister Chloe's lavish real estate development firm faced a catastrophic vendor liquidation weeks before a major launch, the entire financial deficit vanished into thin air before the public could smell blood. My father stood at the head of every family dinner, puffing out his chest, calling himself the unyielding backbone of the Vance industrial legacy, completely oblivious to the fact that he was driving a luxury sedan whose transmission and maintenance accounts were funded by my private corporate credit cards. That was the silence I chose to live in. I would deploy millions to save them at noon and be treated like a secondary, uneducated embarrassment by dinner. The breaking point didn't happen overnight. It arrived in 3 calculated waves of pure betrayal. The first wave hit when Gavin announced he was launching a side venture to advise local maritime firms on automated port infrastructure. Knowing he didn't know the difference between a fiber optic relay and a standard copper wire, I calmly offered to hand him my proprietary lead funnels, client retention models, and automation scripts that actually converted industrial systems. He turned to me, swirled his expensive cocktail, and smirked. "Thanks, Leo, but I'm not going to take industrial engineering or architectural advice from a college dropout who got lucky with a few internet-ordered software tools." My father actually nodded in agreement, stating flatly that a Harvard certification teaches systemic corporate discipline, which matters infinitely more than blue-collar hustle. I smiled, swallowed the humiliation whole, and said nothing. But silence does something lethal when you feed it with your own blood for years. It hardens into absolute forensic clarity. The second wave arrived when I discovered that Gavin had covertly accessed my company's open-source engineering database using an old administrative security key my father had requested years ago for synergy reviews. Gavin didn't just look at the files. He copied my entire proprietary automation script for heavy-duty steel crane infrastructure, filed it under Vance Heavy Industries' corporate patent office, and claimed it as his own masterstroke achievement to win a massive contract with the Great Lakes Port Authority. I didn't confront him immediately. I sat in my dark office, looking at the server logs. My thumb traced the cold edge of my grandfather's steel caliper. Gavin thought he was a ghost in the machine. He had no idea that my automation software contained a hidden, dual-redundant forensic tracking protocol that logged the exact IP address, hardware ID, and geographic location of every single download. He had executed the theft directly from his executive suite on the 40th floor of the Vance Tower. Then, the final wave hit the moment of absolute structural fracture. My father organized a massive, high-stakes executive gala at the Ritz-Carlton to celebrate the 35th anniversary of Vance Heavy Industries. The room was packed with 24 of the most powerful global steel investors, international maritime logistics heads, and federal transport regulators. I attended the dinner clad in a standard tuxedo, carrying a black leather folder. It contained a comprehensive, fully funded $5 million capital restructuring package that would have permanently insulated my parents' personal estate from any future market volatility, allowing my father to retire with absolute dignity without knowing I had funded it. The dinner proceeded exactly the way family humiliations always do, wrapped in normal behavior until the trap snaps shut. Gavin spent the entire evening inserting complex financial buzzwords into ordinary conversations to sound expensive to the New York investors. Chloe bragged about her firm's elite real estate metrics. No one asked me a single question about my life, my operations, or why my hands bore the faint gray marks of industrial carbon. Dessert was served. My father stood up, basking in the absolute authority that only survives if no one in the room has the courage to pull back the curtain. He began his grand speech, thanking the global investors for their trust in Vance Heavy Industries' new automated port infrastructure initiative, the exact initiative built on my stolen code. "We are expanding our empire," my father boomed, his voice echoing through the crystal-lit ballroom. "And to ensure its success, I am officially appointing my firstborn son, Gavin Vance, as the absolute managing partner of our automation divisions, with full control over all future industrial trusts." The room applauded. Gavin stood up, bowing with practiced arrogance. I waited for the noise to subside, then leaned forward, placed my black folder on the table, and said calmly, "Father, before you finalize that allocation, we need to address a critical structural issue in the automated infrastructure patent Gavin just filed. The code he took contains a fundamental logic loop error that will cause the hydraulic brake systems of the port cranes to fail under a load exceeding 800 tons. It's an uncertified risk." The room went completely dead quiet. The New York investors froze, their forks hovering over their plates. Gavin's face went pale, then instantly flashed with a venomous, cornered rage. My father stared at me like I had just committed treason in his church. He didn't look at the technical data I was trying to hand him. He stood up so fast his heavy mahogany chair screeched violently against the marble floor. That was the moment he grabbed the 200-page-heavy brass blueprints folder from the podium and hurled it straight at my face. "You are nothing but an uneducated, jealous grease monkey with good timing," my father roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying, unhinged fury that echoed through the entire Ritz-Carlton ballroom. "How dare you stand in my house, before my investors, and try to make a man with a Harvard education look small? You have no degree, no credentials, and no right to breathe the same air as the real executives in this room. Get out of my sight, you blue-collar lowlife. Your name is officially stripped from the family trust as of tonight. Don't you ever come back here acting like your dirty internet money makes you a Vance?" I stood there as the blood began to trickle down my jawline, completely motionless. I looked at my mother. She stared down at her plate, completely silent. I looked at Chloe. She looked ashamed but refused to meet my gaze. I looked at Gavin. His eyes were shining with a sickening, victorious pleasure. I picked up my purse, slid my grandfather's steel caliper into my pocket, looked at the entire room of frozen billionaires, and said a single quiet phrase, "Okay, fine." I didn't waste 2 minutes crying in my car. I sat behind the wheel, started the engine, and felt my entire emotional landscape turn into something cold, clinical, and mathematically clean. Not broken finished. I drove straight to my condo, packed my life into heavy industrial crates, deleted our family group chat, locked my old house keys in a desk drawer, and by 6:00 a.m., my truck was crossing the state line toward a quiet, industrial coastal facility I had quietly purchased the year before in Savannah, Georgia. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send an angry text. I let my complete and absolute silence become a heavy iron door locking behind them. Savannah didn't just give me a place to rest. It gave me the perfect tactical distance to execute a clinical forensic counteroffensive. I leased a massive, automated dockside laboratory where I began hosting intensive, private engineering workshops for independent maritime operators and supply chain founders who had been locked out by traditional conglomerates. The first workshop was slated for 15 operators. 96 showed up. I understood every single face in that room. Men and women who had been told their practical genius was worthless because it didn't come wrapped in a $200,000 university credential. While I was building this new alliance, my operational team was executing the trap. Clara Sterling, an elite forensic financial analyst who worked alongside Marcus Stone, spent 3 weeks digging through the encrypted back-end servers of the Vance Family Trust. Exactly 21 days after I left Chicago, the door to my Savannah laboratory opened on a humid Saturday afternoon. My brother Gavin stood there, his expensive leather loafers ruined by the gravel yard, his tailored suit soaked in sweat. The smug, untouchable expression he wore at the Ritz-Carlton was completely gone, replaced by a raw, hollow desperation around his bloodshot eyes. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask if my face had healed from the brass binder. He walked straight up to my workbench, leaned in, and tried to use the old language of blood relative leverage. "Leo, you need to come back to Chicago immediately," he said, his voice shaking beneath a forced layer of brotherly charm. Dad was under immense pressure at the gala. Birthdays and anniversaries make old industrial men emotional. You took his words way too personally. Did you drive 11 hours down the coast to give me a psychological review, Gavin? Or did you come to collect something? I asked, without looking up from the pneumatic valve I was calibrating. Gavin flinched, his fingers twisting his platinum gear ring frantically. He swallowed hard and finally pivoted into the real emergency, the Great Lakes Port Authority project, the automated crane infrastructure we launched last week based on the patent. We loaded the first container ship this morning, the hydraulic lines. They suffered a catastrophic pressure loop failure, exactly at an 850-ton load. 2 multi-million-dollar shipping cranes collapsed into the harbor. The entire shipping channel is blocked. The federal transport regulators have halted our operations, and the Port Authority is preparing to sue Vance Heavy Industries for $14 million in liquidated damages by Monday morning. I set my wrench down slowly. The metal clinked against the steel table with an icy, definitive ring. That sounds like a massive structural calculation error, Gavin. Good thing you have that Harvard degree to explain it to the federal inspectors. Leo, stop it, Gavin barked, his face turning an ugly shade of red. The corporate legal team reviewed the deployment files. Because you were the registered chief systems officer for the past 5 years, your automated digital employee ID is stamped on the foundational system architecture. Dad and the legal board have already drafted a corporate liability transfer document. We need you to sign it. It structures the failure as a rogue, non-certified programming mistake by an uncredentialed engineer. It's just a bridge maneuver to keep the insurance company from freezing our primary manufacturing lines. We're family, Leo. You owe the legacy your protection. Before I could answer him, my desktop monitor flashed green. My CFO's face appeared on a live, secure video feed, his voice booming clearly through the workshop speakers. Leo, the forensic financial audit of Vance Heavy Industries is complete, the CFO announced, completely ignoring Gavin's presence. We have successfully mapped the IP addresses. Over the last 48 months, Gavin Vance systematically forged your digital signature to authorize 3 separate uncertified steel shipments from a non-compliant sub-vendor in Panama, pocketing a total of $6.4 million in structural cost deficits, which he funneled into his private real estate shell companies in Miami. The unredacted bank logs, the server keystroke logs, and the certified metallurgy failure reports have just been securely delivered to the senior compliance directors of every institutional investor on the Vance board. Gavin froze. He stared at the screen, then looked back at me like he had finally met a total stranger wearing his little brother's face. The room was dead silent, except for the heavy hum of my workshop's automated ventilation system. I leaned forward, placed both hands on the cold steel table, and zoomed into his eyes. The answer is no, Gavin, I whispered, my voice dropping to a jagged, clinical edge. No liability transfers, no emergency rescues. No more private millions from a college dropout to fund a family of credentialed thieves who publicly degraded me while privately counting on my silence to stay out of a federal penitentiary. If you don't sign this, Dad will lose the entire company. Gavin screamed, his voice cracking into pure, terrified panic. The board will strip our voting shares. You're being selfish because of one argument. Success didn't make me selfish, Gavin, I replied, picking up my grandfather's caliper. It simply made it impossible for parasites like you to keep pretending I owe you my life while receiving nothing but your contempt in return. Now, get off my property before I have my industrial security team remove you in front of the local news cameras. Gavin drove back to Chicago in a state of absolute psychological collapse, and the moment he crossed the city limits, the myth they had built about me officially detonated. He told my father, he told the board, he told everyone the reality of what he had seen in Savannah, the facilities, the automated empire, and the unyielding fact that I held the entire financial and forensic noose around their necks. Within 2 weeks, a major national industrial journal ran an exhaustive front-page feature on my independent automation network. The headline read, "The Iron Mind: How a College Dropout Rebuilt the Great Lakes Industrial Spine Outside the Ivy League Gatekeepers." The article was clinically sharp and devastatingly honest. It described how some of the most brilliant industrial innovators are systematically sabotaged by traditionalist patriarchs whose obsession with institutional credentials blinds them to actual engineering reality. It mentioned, without naming names, that family pride becomes a terminal disease when it relies on stealing the genius of the very children they cast aside. The public fallout hit them like an industrial press. At my father's firm, the article spread through the engineering floors like wildfire. Mid-level managers and floor machinists who had listened to Arthur Vance's lecture for decades about traditional discipline began circulating the piece, laughing openly in the break rooms about how the real engineer of the family had been thrown out like garbage. Major global clients began calling my father's office, half joking and half furious, asking whether Vance Heavy Industries had any actual engineering capability left now that the dropout was running the country's most advanced automation labs. My father did what all fragile, arrogant men do when the concrete truth finally shatters their ego. He got infinitely louder before he broke into pieces. He blew up at a junior compliance officer during an open safety meeting, throwing a glass mug across the room when she mentioned non-traditional software testing protocols. He suffered a massive, stress-related hypertensive breakdown right in the executive cafeteria after an institutional investor called him a credentialed fraud to his face. Within 60 days of my departure, the board of directors formally stripped him of his executive clearance and forced him into a humiliating early retirement package, a corporate execution wrapped in a nicer suit. Gavin's destruction was even more practical. Once the board reviewed the forensic metadata proving he had forged my signature to pass off substandard Panamanian steel, the legal compliance division involved the Federal Transport Authority. He was stripped of his managing partner designation, formally written up for corporate misrepresentation, and blacklisted by every industrial insurance group in the Midwest. The relatives who had spent a decade treating him like the golden prince of the Vance bloodline suddenly stopped answering his frantic phone calls when he pitched his real estate bridge loans. My sister Chloe was the only one who showed a spark of actual human awareness. She sent me a long, unpolished voice memo. Her voice was shaking, devoid of her usual high society performance. "Leo, I knew Dad was completely wrong the night he threw that binder at you," she said. Her breath hitched. I stayed silent because I was terrified he would turn his rage and his financial exile on me next. "I acted like a cowardly spectator while you were bleeding on the floor. I am deeply ashamed of that. You deserved a sister, and I was just an audience member to your execution." I listened to that recording 3 times in the quiet of my Savannah office. Sincerity was such a foreign currency in the Vance lineage that I needed to hear the break in her voice repeatedly before I could trust it. And then came the ultimate poetic twist that felt like a piece of high-octane fiction until the certified letter landed on my desk. The International Maritime and Manufacturing Union, along with the Great Lakes Port Consortium, the single largest coalition of heavy industrial buyers in North America, was hosting their annual Innovation Summit in downtown Chicago. The primary corporate sponsor of the event was Vance Heavy Industries, the company my father spent 35 years dominating. The young, newly appointed director of the summit had read my national feature, bypassed my father's retired carcass entirely, and formally invited me to deliver the grand opening keynote speech on the main stage. The title they proposed made me laugh out loud against the glass of my workshop. Structural Integrity, Building Beyond the Credential. My mother started calling me then, first with soft, hesitant voicemails, then with urgent, daily texts. She kept pleading that the family needed to heal, that Dad was staring at the walls of the house in silence, that Gavin was facing imminent criminal indictments, and that things had simply gotten out of hand. She never once led with a plain, unvarnished admission of what they had actually done to me. Not until I blocked her number entirely. Then, a final text came through my corporate secretary's terminal from my father's private email address. It contained just 4 words. I was completely wrong. The word wrong arrived 30 years late, but it arrived. I told my secretary to relay a single condition. I would not accept a private, comfortable reset. There would be no quiet family dinner where everyone used softer voices and called it closure. If they wanted to stand in the same zip code as me, they would have to face the unmitigated truth publicly, first to themselves, and then to the industry they had misled. The Grand Convention Hall in downtown Chicago was a cavern of polished steel, glass, and massive corporate banners hanging from the ceiling like iron monuments to old wealth. When I walked backstage at 9:00 a.m., Chloe was waiting near the green room, clad in a simple black dress, looking smaller and less certain than I had ever seen her. She hugged me, a tight, trembling embrace. I allowed it, but I didn't lean into it. She knew she hadn't earned the old comfort yet, and she stepped back respectfully, handing me her phone. "You need to see this before you walk out there, Leo," she whispered. The screen displayed a recorded video conference from the week prior, a mandatory family summit involving my aunts, uncles, cousins, and the primary institutional investors of our family trust. On the recording, my mother stood before the family camera, crying openly, admitting that they had systematically minimized my labor, stolen my engineering code, and allowed my father's toxic pride to morph into pure industrial cruelty. Then, my father appeared on screen. He looked haggard, his posture broken, his chest hollowed out. He spoke in a flat, miserable tone, directly to the camera. I publicly insulted and exiled the son who was quietly keeping this entire dynasty alive. I confused a university degree with human and structural worth. I was entirely wrong. It wasn't an elegant video, and it didn't heal the scar on my face, but it was absolute, forensic, and documented before the only audience that mattered to them. I handed the phone back to Chloe, thanked her for forcing the truth into the open, and walked out onto the main stage. The stadium lighting blinded me for a split second before the 40-foot LED screen behind me illuminated my name. Leo Vance, founder and CEO of Vance Industrial Automation. I looked down at the front row of the VIP section. They were sitting right there. Arthur Vance, his shoulders squared too hard in an old suit, his face trapped in a state of absolute shame and stubborn agony. Gavin sat right next to him, looking hollowed out, his hands tucked beneath his lap to hide the fact that his platinum gear ring was missing. My mother sat between them, her eyes red, clutching a handkerchief. The master of ceremonies introduced me, listing my firm's metrics, our multi-state expansion, and our role in saving the regional maritime logistics pipeline from catastrophic engineering failures. The entire hall erupted into applause. My father didn't clap at first, but as the thunderous noise of 2,000 industry executives surged around him, The sheer pressure of the room dragged his old hands together, forcing him to applaud his own exiled son against his structural will. I stood at the center of that podium, looked out at the sea of operators, and abandoned the safe, corporate speech I had outlined on the plane. True structural integrity cannot be forged on paper. My voice boomed through the high-powered audio system. Cold, clear, and absolute. We live in an industrial world that has become obsessed with the packaging of credentials, allowing men in tailored suits to believe they own the truth because they own a golden frame on a wall. But when a multi-ton crane fails at a dock, or when a blast furnace stands on the edge of a thermal explosion, those frames will not hold the weight. The code doesn't care about your pedigree. The steel doesn't care about your alma mater. Talent, genius, and absolute reliability arrive in grease-stained boots, far more often than they do in executive boardrooms. The room went completely, viscerally still. I locked my eyes directly onto my father's trembling face. A man's value is revealed long before his corporate resume impresses you, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a diamond blade. The ultimate test of your character is how you treat an operator when you believe you hold all the power, and how fast you crawl back to them when your own engineered lies leave you buried under the rubble. The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unmitigated truth. By the time I walked off that stage, the entire auditorium was on its feet. A standing ovation that shook the concrete foundations of the convention center. Not because I had won a petty argument, but because an unvarnished, naked truth spoken without apology possesses a physical, terrifying force of its own. After the ceremony, the summit director led me into a private corridor for a press photo, and then, with a polite, clinical cruelty that felt like pure art, he turned to my father, who had followed us into the hallway, and said, "Arthur, you must be incredibly proud to have raised the absolute future of this industry." That was the exact millisecond my father finally broke. The rigid structure of his face completely dissolved into something old, broken, and deeply pathetic. His voice went incredibly thin as he looked at my scar and whispered, "Leo, please, can we step into a private room? We need to talk about the family assets. We need to talk about us." My mother stood behind him, nodding through her tears, while Gavin hung back like a ghost against the concrete wall. "There is no us to restructure, Father," I said calmly, looking at him through a lens of absolute clarity. "I didn't become a valuable engineer today because 2,000 strangers stood up for my name. I was valuable the night you threw that brass folder at my face. I was valuable when I was 19, bleeding inside your burning blast furnace while you were sleeping in your mansion. And I was valuable when I was funding the very infrastructure you used to look down on me." He began to cry then, an old man's silent, dry tears that carried zero weight in my chest. Gavin tried to step forward, his voice cracking as he began to admit how he had built his entire identity by feeling superior to me, and how he had tried to borrow my genius because his own hands were empty. I listened to every word they said. I marked their expressions. But I did not reward a single one of them with a cheap, cinematic absolution. Moving forward, the architecture of our relationship is strictly limited, I told them, my voice as unyielding as a forensic audit contract. There will be no shared capital, no family access to my automation facilities, no corporate bailouts for Gavin's criminal liabilities. Chloe can call my operations desk once a month. Mother can text my personal line on holidays. But you, Father, you will never speak to me with a shred of entitlement or authority again. If you want to see my face, you will buy a ticket to my public summits like every other operator in this country. He nodded slowly, a broken, submissive, mechanical movement, learning the language of boundaries far too late to ever sound natural in it. I flew back to Savannah the next morning. Home. The word finally meant a territory I had engineered with my own two hands, not a room where my bloodline evaluated my worth. A week later, I stood barefoot on the back deck of my coastal facility, watching the dark Atlantic tide move beneath the stars. The air was thick, clean, and completely devoid of Chicago's smog. I thought about the kid who walked out of that skyscraper bleeding, saying nothing but, "Okay, fine," because he knew that arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you is the fastest way to make yourself small. I used to think revenge meant making them bleed the way they made me bleed. I know better now. The real revenge was letting the forensic data of their own actions stand still long enough for them to drown in it. The real revenge was building a life so structurally sound that their validation became completely irrelevant to my breathing. The real revenge was that when they finally came looking for my value, I no longer needed them to confirm it. I had already done the hardest engineering work myself. I had chosen me first.